Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here on Varn blog as we wrap up this Radical Engagement series as a whole in this little mini series on Lars Lih's Chapter 1 on Lenin Rediscovered What Is to Be Done, which is part of Section 1 of the Marxist Unity Group Reader. Now, I'm just going to editorialize a bit about some things that I might actually have issues with in regards to Lars Lih here. I think his scholarship's actually, in the main, quite good and quite against sectarian shibboleths that were passed down from both Marxist Leninist and Leninist, aka Maoist, Comintern aligned, and Trotskyist parties, which had a very hard split on the difference between Trotsky and Lenin, particularly earlier Lenin, and particularly this portrayal of the vanguard party as not an educational vanguard who seeks to merge socialists from various classes into the worker movement, but also a correction from just how much of Russian Social Democratic and later on Bolshevik early policy was still based in Second International doctrines, for mostly good, but some for ill. Yet, there are a couple of trends I've seen here that I do want to address. One is that Lih often blurs the line between describing Kautsky's opinion and editorializing, meaning I can't tell when Lih is endorsing Kautsky's opinion as truth or just explaining Kautsky's opinion, period. And that really does make a difference to how I interpret this text, because some of Kautsky's necessary arguments that we have to play out here, frankly, don't hold. They're not actually all that strong of an argument. They are rooted in parts of Marx. They're not alien to Marx, but they don't deal with other parts of Marx that cut in other directions, nor do they just hold on a logical grounds. There's no reason that the automaticity of the working class fulfilling this teleological role assigned to it logically flows as a historical necessity. And that's even at the time, much less looking back on it from the 21st century, where many of the assumptions of the Second International did not happen at all. And for that matter, we don't know where Lenin deviates from his own writings. I know from reading Lenin that he changes his mind quite a bit. So explaining and contextualizing what is to be done in a way that's very interesting is useful as a historical analysis, but it does not necessarily explain what the Bolsheviks actually did, particularly during the Red Terror in the early 1920s and the Civil War, and why these were codified as practices beyond that when they are out of step with the implications of this book. Mike McNair does talk about that a little bit in his revolutionary strategy, but as I said 5 years ago in a reading group with the Emancipation Network, I'm not convinced that McNair deals with all the economic and material reasons super well why the Bolsheviks ended up in the cul-de-sac that they ended up either. He mainly treats it as a political issue, which it undoubtedly was, but it wasn't just that. But McNair, I find, at least handles the situation, whereas this is outside of the scope of this book. But since we have editorializing that seems to be about what we should think about what we would do now based on the Lenin-Kautsky connection, it seems a little weird not to have that editorializing here or to hide it in places where I can't tell if Lars Lih is presenting his own opinion or speaking for Kautsky. These are problems, and they're problems that I actually find interesting that other historians have not really delved into in this book. This book is massive, it's extensive, and since the overwhelming scholarship in it is quite good, I can see why people would ignore these not minor flaws from trying to develop a political strategy, but maybe minor flaws in a historical book. We also can see a kind of voluntarist tint in Lih's interpretation of what is going on. Sometimes Lih agrees with me that not focusing on things like workers' dignity, which communist parties kind of refused to do after the 1930s, was a serious problem, rhetorically speaking and strategically and tactically speaking, although their ideological reason for not doing so may have been sound. It's not scientific after all. But here, Lih doesn't really tease out the scientificity arguments versus the moral arguments. He kind of leans towards the volunteerist readings, but pointing out the scientificity, for lack of a better word, of the project. I don't know what to make of that, and that might be inconsistent and it might not be. I have read this book before, but it's massive, and I read it many, many years ago. This book came out in 2006. I think I read it in like 2014. So even my reading of it is about a decade in the past. So reading it again and reading it so closely, you start noticing a few things. Now, I don't know that I'm going to continue not doing radical engagements after reflecting on this, but I am going to stop the series for a while. I have other things I want to teach you, and I'm not giving up on that. But it is interesting when I do these line by line re-engagements versus when I quick read during college or for another show, how much more I notice and how much more critical there is to come out. You may say it's easy to be a critic and hard to build a productive argument, but the truth is everyone who's got any artistic or historical or intellectual sensibility actually has to do both. Anyway, so those caveats aside, let's get into social democracy as good news. And we'll see if these criticisms that I have of Lih continue. For those of you following along, it is page 49 of the Marxist Unity Group Reader, but it is page 38 in Linear Rediscovered, the Brill text, and we'll get right back to it. Quote book. We have canvassed Karl Kautsky's pronouncements on a number of topics, and we shall see echoes of them all in Lenin's writing. The power of these pronouncements does not stem merely from Kautsky's authoritative status. His various opinions are unified and anchored in three ways: the narrative logic of the merger formula, by the authority of the Communist Manifesto, and by the prestige of actually existing social democracy in Germany. And I would agree with all of that, except I would say none of that actually says that the argument's logically sound. But anyway, let's continue. We're going to even say that for readers such as Lemon, the Communist Manifesto and the Erfurt program stand in a Old Testament, New Testament relation to each other, the way I think the Communist Manifesto and Capital and Goethe critique stand to each other, but that's just me. I know Lars Lih is not a big fan of the way people use Goethe critique. See his Platypus affiliated letter to and review of Kevin Anderson's translation of it recently. The New Testament tells us a story that is supposed to govern our lives, and then backs up this claim by arguing that the events of the story have unfolded secundarium scripturis as predicted by earlier authoritative writings. The Erfurt program tells an idealized version of the story of the SPD, past, present, and future, as a confirmation and predictions of the Communist Manifesto. In this way, it strengthens the authoritative status of both the manifesto and the SPD model. That's an analogy doing a shit ton of work. Since the manifesto and the Erfurt program are both programs that tell idealized versions of history, and the manifesto is one that predicts one, and the Erfurt program tells a different story, but they're basically myths. I don't mean myths as in false. The Erfurt program's idealized version of the SPD is not false, but it doesn't deal with all the contradictions within it, including what led to the Ebert government. Or the fact that, there were right-wing elements in the SPD, even in the 19 teens, which led to the necessity of what was a three-part split in revolutionary social democracy between the anti-war center, which became the Independent Social Democratic Party, the communists, which became the Spartacist Bund, and people aligned with the Third International, and the various offshoots of the Second International, including the 2.5 International with the Austro-Marxists, etc. The offer program leaves nothing about that, and that's going to happen almost immediately after what is to be done is to be written. So one can't just deal with this Old Testament, New Testament relation as some kind of obvious way of understanding things. This is a metaphor. The metaphor is making an argument, and part of the reason you would use a metaphor to make an argument is maybe that you realize that history doesn't make the actual argument all that obvious anymore. All right, back to this. The merger formula, social democracy as a merger of socialism and the worker movement, puts all of Kautsky's various arguments together. The expanding circle of awareness, the original and nearly failed separation of socialism and the worker movement, the two-front polemical war against those who refuse the great Marxian synthesis, the Lassalleans, political freedom as light and air for the proletariat, the strength that comes from the inspiring final goal, and the need for the disciplined modern parties of nationwide scope, the aspiration to become a Volkspartei, a people's party, the need to carry out a democratic task that the bourgeois is too scared to undertake, going all the way back to Marx talking about bourgeois failure in the Brumaire, and finally, social democracy's own exhausted sense of mission. All these flow from the merger narrative. And I agree, they do. But it's a narrative that didn't play out. In order for the worker class to accomplish its socialist mission, it must understand this mission and make itself capable of overcoming all resistance to its completion. Social democracy can provide the prerequisite insight and organization only if it builds up an efficient nationwide organization. It can only do this as it has obtained political freedom. Political freedom, along with many other demands of the minimum program, allows and indeed compels social democracy to become a tribune of the people. The merger formula is not confined to Kautsky. In fact, if there's one thing that united both the orthodox and opportunists, it was the loyalty to the merger formula as a definition of social democracy. A brief summary will bring out the foundation nature of the merger formula. And this may be true, but I don't know that this is actually the good argument that is being presented up here. Okay. Conrad Smith, as a member of the German Social Democratic Party, who leaned towards revisionism. In an article devoted to showing the many ways in which the Communist Manifesto had become dated, he started off with its appreciation of its fundamental contribution. MB, modern socialism is a synonym for social democracy. The essence of modern socialism lies in the connection between the working class movement and a final goal beyond bourgeois capitalist society. Modern socialism found itself faced, firstly, with a spontaneous working class movement that had arisen as a reaction to unrestricted capitalist exploitation, and secondly, with the conception of collectively organized production and distribution of goods, which had arisen out of the mainstream of practical life, from the criticism of the irrationality of bourgeois property. What socialism achieved was a combination of mutual interaction of both these movements, and an interaction which stripped the actual working class movement of its native limitations and the socialist idea of its utopian character. The materialist conception of history, ellipses, and ellipses are always important, although I don't know how I track this text down easily, particularly since I need to read it in German, provided the conceptual means of achieving this reconstructive combination. In 1808, the American socialist Robert Hunter published an informative and useful survey of the European socialist movement. In this book, he looks into the conflict within social democracy between Marxists and reformists, but he insisted that there was still a fundamental difference between committed social democrats of either camp and socialists such as Fabians, who thought they could dispense with an independent political organization of the proletariat, or with substitutionists who think they can do that too. Cough, cough, people. You know who you are. To bring out the fundamental difference, he cited with approval the words of the reformist Jean Jaurès, one of the leaders of the French Socialist Party. The reader will find little that is new in Jaurès' words, but some repetition is inevitable when one wants to document the existence of a commonplace. Quote, to Marx belongs the merit, perhaps the only one of all attributed to him, that has fully withstood the trying test of criticism and of time. That's a backdoor compliment, right? Of having drawn together and unified the labor movement and socialist idea. In the first third of the 19th century, labor struggled and fought against the crushing power of capital, but it was not conscious itself towards what end it was straining. It did not know the true objective of its efforts was the common ownership of property. And on the other hand, Socialism did not know that the labor movement was a living form in which its spirit was embodied, the concrete practical force of which it stood to need. Brackets Marx enriched the practical movement by the idea and to the theory he added practice. He brought the socialist thought into proletarian life and proletarian life into socialist thought. And again, normally I would check out what is bracketed, but I think I would need to know French. So anyway, I have just given the words of a Frenchman as cited by a contemporaneous American. No, I wouldn't. I'd have to check the Richard Hunt citation. Never mind. And now give the words of a Belgian, Emile van der Velde, as cited by a contemporaneous Russian. Quote, the theory of socialism born of compassion remained divided from day-to-day socialism born of suffering. It required long years of heavy ordeals for the thinkers and the proletarians to join forces and extend a hand to each other. The Russian social democrat who cited these words, Vladimir Akimov, did not himself like the emphasis on the separation, but nevertheless acknowledged that this image has been used repeatedly as a figurative description of the development of the social labor movement. The merger narrative was used as a template for the developments in Russia by Uli Martov, or Julius Martov, as he's often called in English, when he published a pioneering historical sketch of the struggles of the Russian proletariat in 1900. The work begins with the words, quote, the contemporary international socialist worker movement consists of two streams that for a long time developed independently of each other. There follows a familiar account of Western developments lifted from Kautsky's Erfurt program, ending with a consummation devoutly to be wished. Quote from Martov. Socialism came to the economic movement of the worker class. And I'm guessing worker class here means that this was translated by Lars Lih, so this would be from Russian. It took on itself the task of becoming the expression of the common interest of the class movement. And meanwhile, the worker class movement came to socialism. The working masses started to see in socialism the final aim of their own historical movement. Thus took place the fusion of the practical worker movement with the theoretical thought. Thus was realized that Lassalle called the union of science and the workers. The idea of socialism became the idea of the worker class. The Socialist Party became its advancement, detachment, or vanguard. That's in brackets. This is how things turned out in all countries. Did it though? Speaking of the struggle of the Russian revolutionary movement, we must also trace the development of economic struggle of the worker masses and development of socialist thought up to that moment when it became the patrimony of the proletariat. In the rest of the pamphlet, Martov traces the intermingling of socialism and the worker movement into a way that brings about both the canonical essence, and local particularities of the Russian story. Thus, in absolutist Russia, the Social Democrats themselves had to take over much of the job the trade unions and the like had done in the West, namely, to give an organized and sensible character to the Shinhini elemental worker movement. I guess like basic or primal. Sorry, I don't know how to deal with that translation. The thrust earned by the Social Democrats in line of the activity helped them in their more basic task of, quote, sowing in the masses the awareness of the class interests of the proletariat, of the necessity of unifying in the struggle for socialism, and the necessity of conquest of political freedom as the first stage of the path and the forward liberation from exploitation. We have seen the merger narrative's canonical status endorsed in various ways by the Czech, German, Belgian, American, a Frenchman, and a Russian. And I believe we may consider it established its central role in the part of international social democracy's doctrinal identity. And I would agree with you, Dr. Lih. Anyway, the aim of this chapter is to provide the social democratic context for what is to be done. Today, when scholars can affirm the Communist Manifesto wasn't directed by Kautsky and by social democrats in general, or that Marx was nihilistic about political freedom, which he absolutely wasn't, even I knew that. Hal Draper knew that too. That was well talked about before Lars Lih. It was just forgotten in the 1980s and 90s for obvious Cold War reasons. Right? The view of the social democracy presented here may be surprising. Not really, but I also grew up after this book came of age. 100 years ago, it was commonplace to any informed observer. To bring this out, I conclude this chapter by looking at the spirit of social democracy through the two eyes of its two observers from the beginning and towards the end of an era of the pre-World War social democracy. These two passages will anchor my good news interpretation of social democracy. Man, it is weird to become evangelical about social democracy this way in a work of history. I do think that probably needs to be discussed more, but I don't think people take left-wing scholarship all that seriously sometimes because you just don't see people engage with it rigorously. Seriously, I mean, like, bourgeois historians just kind of don't. According to this interpretation, the self-appointed mission of the social democracy was to bring the good news of their world's historical mission to the workers in a confident expectation they would receive the message and carry out the mission. I'm gonna side note here. One of the things about when people don't take works of scholarship by left-wing historians seriously, it's like Caliban and the Rich gets its categories wrong. It can't get the number of witches straight. It and by categories, it gets both Marxian categories and historical categories of who's doing what wrong. And a lot of people today, ever since the left communists, come to the same conclusion I did when I read it, that it was just super sloppy. The regrettable history brothers read it and had the same response. It doesn't get a lot of historical engagement with by other scholars who went through and talked about its historical problems. You see people deal with its theoretical issues, but not its historical issues. This comes up a lot in other places too. I am a mixed bag about Jay Sakai's Settlers book. I think, maybe 6% good, 40% messed up, including it's assuming that non-white peoples had clear national blockings and met any kind of historical definition of a nation as a way of manifesting class consciousness. He assumed that nation consciousness and class consciousness are the same, but also there's just some historical facts that are excellent in that book, and there's some that are off. But you can't get people generally, other than academics who are partisan against Maoists, to often take that book seriously enough to go through and deal with its historical claims. Or you hear people say it is a polemic. I'm sorry, being a polemic does not mean you get to make shit up. And I don't think Jason Kyle was making shit up. I don't think a lot of people were making shit up. Frederici wasn't out to make shit up, and Caliban and the Witch either, but it doesn't mean that she wasn't sloppy. And I think we could actually solidify these arguments by going back and clarifying them, and pointing out where they're being overly polemical and loose with the facts or loose with the categories or inconsistent, instead of just writing them off or celebrating them as if they're the most brilliant thing ever written, when there's clear, obvious problems to anyone who knows this history area. It is not just to debunk a book to talk about its flaws. And I say that because I think this is true here. There's a mixture of advocacy and historicism here in this Lars Lih chapter that a little bit concerns me, because I can't always tell when we are seeing editorializing that is endorsing the strategy from Lars Lih and when he's just describing what Kotsky thought. The objective narration of the book makes that unclear. Now, that is a convention of historical writing, but one that I've always found a little bit problematic because it's a way to hide opinions. All right, anyway. The first passage is by John Way and reveals the Marxian roots of political strategy implied by social democracy's mission. And the second passage by Robert Hunter reveals the emotional exaltation that surrounded the mission. John Ray was a learned economic historian who wrote one of the first scholarly biographies of Adam Smith, from which he accurately deduced his hostility to socialism. Nevertheless, in his 1884 publication, Contemporary Socialism, contains a chapter on Karl Marx that must be one of the very first academic discussions of Marx in any language, and, in my opinion, an excellent one, due to his particular recognition of the importance of young Marx's Hegelian background. In the edition of 1884, not 44, Ray noted that it was remarkable that the works of Marx were so little known in England, even though they stirred up a commotion as far away as Russia, especially since Das Kapital was so imbued with things English. But an English translation of Das Kapital had appeared in 1887, leading Ray to remark that the second edition of the 1891 that we, quote, have therefore grown more familiar of the late with the name and importance of Karl Marx. I mean, I think this is about America, how much of Karl Marx's stuff is actually published in the American presses in the 1840s and 50s, and like, we just hide that. But anyway, in his chapter on Marx, he quotes Marx's criticism of the original outlook of the Communist League, the organization for which he drafted the Communist Manifesto. Quote, its work could have no tenable theoretical basis except that of a scientific insight into the economic structure of society, and this ought to be put into a popular form, not with the view of carrying out any utopian system, but of promoting amongst the working classes and other classes a self-conscious participation in the historical transformation of society that was taking place under their eyes. Ray comments that this was always with Marx the distinctive and ruling feature of a system. And after noting that Marxist belief is an economic evolution, he describes that link to practical political strategy implied by Marx's system. I cite this passage in extenso because not only because I think it's one of the best things ever written by an academic scholar about Marx. I need to read this Ray book, I think. Thank you, Lars Lih, for pointing it out to me. But because it proves that even in 1884, the year after Marx's death, when German social democracy was still struggling to come into existence, political strategies that inspired Marx was clearly apparent to the attentive reader of Marx. Quote, Marx thought that the League should also change its methods and tactics. Its work, being that of the social revolution, was different from the work of the old political conspirators and secret societies, and therefore needed different weapons. The times, too, were changing and offered new instruments, street insurrection, surprises, intrigues, pronunciamentos that may overturn a dynasty or oust a government or bring them into reason, but were of no avail in a world for introducing collective property or abolishing the wage labor. Yep, sorry, people. You're not going to riot form yourself into a post-wage labor society. People would just begin the day after to work for hire and rent their farms just as the day before. A social revolution needed other and larger participation. It needed to have the whole population first thoroughly leavened with its principles. Nay, it needed to possess an international character, depending not on detached local outbreaks, but on steady concern in the revolutionary action and on the part of the laboring classes everywhere. The cause was not political or even national, but social. And society, which was indeed already pregnant with the change, must be aroused to a conscious consent to the delivery. What was first to be done, therefore, was to educate and move public opinion. And in this work, the ordinary secret society went but a little way. Take that, Blinky. A secret propaganda might still be carried on, but a public and open propaganda was more effectual and more suitable to the times. There never existed a greater facility for the movement and ought to make use of all the abundant means of popular agitation and communication which modern society allowed. No more secret societies and holes and corners, no more small rings and petty plots, but a great broad organization working in open day and working relentlessly by the tongue and pen to stir the masses of all of European countries to a common international revolution. Marx sought, in short, to introduce a large system of production into the art of conspiracy. I present this next passage by Robert Hunter, who we've already discussed, with some hesitation. I read it out loud in a 2001 conference on what is to be done in Essen, Germany, and was told that I was perceived as making a hysterical attack on Lenin. I was also told that any comparison between Marxism and religion was nothing but a petty bourgeois ploy. Yeah, I don't agree with that either, as much as I would like to. But speaking as a historian, I say that the emotional fervor and dedication evoked by this passage was an essential part of social democracy, very much including the Russian Social Democrat Lenin. Anyone who is embarrassed by Hunter's rhetoric will also be embarrassed by the Marxist left at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. That's true. They would be, actually, including many Bolsheviks. But my motive in bringing the passage forth here is not to make the should-be banal point about socialism of the era being compared to religious belief in its intensity and demands, a point that revolutions themselves have often made, including in the fact that even Engels and other parties have called revolutionary statements and programs catechisms. I mean, it's kind of hard to avoid the religious argument when that's literally the basis. When I was thinking about Baring's book, Vulgar Marxism, which is about revolutionary pedagogy and teaching the workers and basically about how you do this worker merger thesis and pedagogical statements, they actually did have to explicitly model things on religious movements because they had the most effective public education programs that went beyond dependence on the state. And that's still true. Although it may be waning as YouTube and other forms of ersatz diffuse communication through platform capitalists change that some bit. All right, back to the text. I rather want to demonstrate how socialist fervor expressed itself in the story of the inspired and inspiring activist who is spreading the word of social democracy by this means and is building up a worldwide army of fighters for the cause. A long quote from Robert Hunter. Almost unknown to the world outside of the labor movement, as the universe grows and prospers, its vitality is incredible. Its humanitarian ideals come to those whose labor is drink to parched throats. Its creed and scientific program call for passion and adherence. Its converts serve with it a daily devotion that knows no limit of sacrifice. And in the face of persecution, misrepresentation, even martyrdom, they remain loyal and true. From Russia, across Europe and America to Japan, from Canada to Argentina. It crosses frontiers, breaks through the barriers of language, nationality, and religion as it spreads from factory to factory, from mill to mill, from mine to mine, touching as it goes the religion of life with millions of the underworld. It converts works into every city, town, and hamlet into industrial nations, spreading the new gospel amongst the poor and lowly who listen to their words with religious intensity. Tired workmen pour over the literature which these missionaries leave behind them and fall to sleep over open passages. The youth, inspired by its lofty ideals and elevated thought, lead the factory of joyous anticipation to read through the night. All right, supplemental readings. And I'm going to comment on this. So these are what the Marxist Union Group saying should be read by this chapter. 1, Freedom in the Fight for Power by Lenin from 1906, which makes sense because it's a little bit before what is to be done. I think it's excellent. It's an excellent defense of democratic republicanism. Whether Lenin maintains it through the end of his life is a whole question. I also think this little thing, Lenin by Lars Lih, which is a short and accessible biography of his social democratic heritage, I think is okay. I have criticized this book, though, because even though I know Lars Lih is aware of Lenin's work and stuff during the Civil War, in fact, some of his earlier scholarship is what the Bolsheviks did during the Russian Civil War, I actually find it a little bit problematic how much it jumps from the pre-1914 period to the pre-1923, to the post-1923-24 period, leaving the question of 1970 through the Red Terror and into the Civil War more of an open question about how much it actually comports with what Lenin actually did biographically. And I also think the writings of Lenin vary so much during this time period. For example, the discussions of whether or not Lenin believed that socialism in one country is possible seems to vary quite a bit depending on what's going on. Both Lenin and Stalin, according to the works of Aaron Van Marie, for example, both Stalin and Trotsky had real basis in Lenin's writing about which version of internationalism or socialism in a country was viable. They all had legitimate quotes from Lenin from different time periods. Lenin's this little biography by Lars Lih leaves it out. I think that is a little bit suspect, and so I tend to tell people to read Neil Harding or other more complete biographies of Lenin, not just the Lars Lih one. And I don't think the stuff in Lars Lih is wrong. I just think there's sort of an omission that is not unproblematic, to use a phrase of diplomatic art. And then the Historical Accomplishment of Karl Marx by Karl Kautsky is a 1908 text. I think it's fine as far as things go. I agree with the merger formula being crucial to the socialist movement. I think Mike Miner's revolutionary strategy does the best job writing it out. I think there's stuff absent from this. I think some of the questions even asked by the people who put this together themselves, which I'm going to go back up to and remind you of, since that was 7 or 8 episodes ago, will really help. I actually don't know if the writer of the intro to this book was Peter Moody or Parker McQueenie, because they both have PM names and they're both part of the early cadre of people who are on both Cosmonaut Magazine and the Marxist Unity Group. I still believe in the merger formula, but I think we have to deal with its problems today, one of which being the structure of the working class itself. And I don't know that the voluntarism gets you to deal with that very, very strongly. But I want to look at these initial questions that they asked as getting into the text. All right, describe the merger formula as place in history of social democracy. The merger formula's realization that socialism did not come out of the working class movement itself, that it had bourgeois and intellectual origins. Whether or not the intellectuals are a consistent class is its own question. We could deal with that another time. But that it needed to be disciplined by and subordinate to the worker movement because the workers were the subject of its historical concern. Describe the components of Erfurtism, which is basically the programism of classical social democracy. Describe Lih's circle awareness. I think Leninists have actually realized the same thing, and they've turned this into like, the masses, blah, blah, blah. I don't like the masses. I think the masses actually is a way to class compromise with some people I don't think you can collaborate with. And I don't mean like the peasants who A, aren't that big of a working concern in most industrial economies today anyway, and B, of course you can work with the peasants. There's something more beyond it. What is the good news conception of social democracy? Why is social democracy needed, and why is it heeded by the working class? Again, this is a leading question, because you are asking this as it is a historical question, but you are basing it off of arguments. Those are two different things. If you wanted to make this a less leading question, which maybe you don't want to do, you would say, what is the good news conception of the social democracy? Why did it see democracy as needed, social democracy needed, and why will it be heeded by the working class according to its argument? And then the next question, was it, why or why not? There's a difference between a leading pedagogical question and one that actually wants you to actually deal with the situations. This has an ideological motive. I like this study guide. I actually do think it's good, but when people read study guides and hit questions like this, they should really ask themselves, what am I being led to believe? Why is political freedom and light and air for the movement? I mean, obviously, it's important because without political freedom, you can't advocate for what you want. What's the history of light and air metaphor? It's super old. How did the Russian Social Democrats describe it? Good point. We talked about that already. Lars Lih doesn't mention the demand for a democratic republic in the open chapter. Why not be the case? Can Lih's conclusions be taken as definitive? And I would say Lih's conclusions on the merger formula's importance to historical social democracy can be taken as definitive. I don't know that everything else can. One, I'm not sure that Lenin is as consistent as these chapters want to make them outside of individual works. Lenin was a very flexible thinker, and that could be for good and ill. Two, Democratic Republicans may be in 2006. Democratic Republics maybe in 2006 seen as too generously obvious, but that was actually the moment where Democratic Republics started to weaken internationally. Like literally, that's the moment where it starts. It's not with Trump, and it had been building in kind of anti-democratic measures in the administrative state of democracies since the 1970s and 80s. And this accelerated after the end of the Cold War. Ironically, the Cold War may have kept some of the democratic spirit of the administrative apparatus a little longer, despite the need to repress democratic movements both externally and abroad during the Cold War. I'm not quite sure on that. I don't have a way to work that out historically, but I think we need to. But ultimately, I think this is an important work. I don't agree with every line of it, nor should you, I don't think. But I think the Marxist Unity Group people and Mike McNair are right to pick up on something here. It is not that all the forms of Marxism flow organically from Marx's original text, but they do flow from it. And there are things in there that people like Hal Draper and other people have talked about the want for political freedom, the need for democratic development, et cetera, that people have tried to bracket out, including left communist and anarchist critics of Marx and also liberal critics of Marx who want to pretend that he didn't care about quote bourgeois freedoms unquote. He absolutely did. Same with Lenin, even if that takes particular ways, because in all crises you see breaches of democratic etiquette. The issue is, do you turn them into the grounds for permanent freezes of those political freedoms? And in doing so, do you waive the political responsibilities they imply? And I think in the liberal world, we see that people very much have. We need to think about how socialists react to that, and thinking about the relationship between Kautsky and Lenin will help you get there, even if I don't think we can take the idea that we can just one-to-one implement Kautsky social democracy and get to, a Bolshevik response and just talk about how early Leninism is super great. I say this as a person who thinks, of the various factions in the DSA, which I'm a member. I like a couple of them. Both Bread and Roses Caucus and Marxist Unity Caucus do take inspiration from neo-Kautskyism, which itself is a political development out of the historical work Lars Lih did in this book. You can also take the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Central Committee, the CPGB-PCC, where Matt McNair and Jack Ross and a few other people, I think it's Ross, and a few other people really have concentrated their efforts to see where this develops. And I think it's been intellectually one of the most fruitful developments of Marxism, period, outside of the ultra left, which I also think has been intellectually fruitful but highly problematic. All that said, I think we do need to put some pressure on this to see where the fractures are, even in this original work. And that's what this was supposed to do, this series, this radical engagement series. My fear, and I think, is that it was either patronizing or Talmudic. I've lost people for my criticisms of Engels's own authority as inconsistent with some of Engels's own work and being economically incorrect about the development of work over time. I have lost people for all kinds of stuff that I've said. I have been placed in almost every single tendency on the American left today, from Maoist to Trotskyist to, not many people call me a straightforward Marxist-Leninist, to just a normal social democrat. To some degrees, I think that is because I am trying to get us back to the spirit of criticizing, but also endorsing what is good in all of our movements so that we can come to something that's actually politically effective. And I think in that light, the neo-Kautsky turn was very fruitful. And with the resurgence of Marxism in America after the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, and 2009. After all, I that's what pushed me there. That and the political betrayals of Barack Obama, which I now see people making excuses for, like, oh, that was progressive then, and we've moved so much further, which is why Obama seems like a milquetoast moderate. No, Obama always seemed like a milquetoast moderate. People wanted him to be something else. But I remember at the time being like, I don't think you have the evidence, even though he sometimes went hard on the Clintons. I think we have to ask ourselves if we're doing the same thing on Kautsky. Are we trying to make the Second International more left-wing than it actually ended up being, even in theory, because there was such a misrepresentation of it in literature in the mid and late 20th century from both sectarians and from new left scholars? Are we overcorrecting? I wonder what a lot of the people involved would say. And since a lot of them listen to me, I might find out. Radical Engagements as a 3-year project has been important to me. I still am worried that going back to dealing with summarized text and whatnot, even though I know it will get more viewers and listeners, will lead people to trust glosses instead of checking the text themselves, particularly in a time period where I find that even scholars will repeat misunderstandings and miscitations from secondary sources multiple times through many indirect citations without even knowing where the original comes from. And that is not just in the history of the left. I see this everywhere today. Scholarship has actually declined as the push for more scholarship increases. It is obvious that as you increase production like that, the care and standards involved would actually decrease. We now live in a area where the humanities are in free fall anyway, so maybe it's not as much of an issue today. I don't know. Regardless of all that, I think it is fair for us to take the light and air from this, that pushing for political freedom and for fixing the democratic republic is somewhat of a way forward, even if it is limited and not even sufficient for a minimum program. We don't know what the content of that will be. And right now, while socialism is more popular than ever in the United States, well, not than ever, than it has been since the 1930s, we also are dealing with a time period in which it's what it is a lot more unclear to people. I think it's time to clarify some of this stuff. And so I hope I do that in the future. I've enjoyed doing this series on the mug reader. I'm kind of glad I called it though, beyond section 1, because I think it would have taken me a good several years to do all of this together. I do think people should download this. Is free, and read it for yourself. And in fact, I would tell people to download several of these different sectarian and caucus-based readers and read them for yourselves with their questions and compare them. I'm also going through one on Marxism, Leninism, Maoism right now. And I'm generating my own that I try to make non-sectarian for people. And a variety of topics, because there's only a few groups that have done them well, and they have dominated the conversation even when their theory has been bad. There's no reason in this day and age for someone like me not to help you and engage in this, and not for you to read the free materials that are available to you. But also, you need to do something with them. Just reading them makes it an intellectual hobby. Just listening to me talk about it makes it an intellectual hobby. If you don't do something with it, it wasn't worth doing. I'd like to thank all my sponsors, and I hope you enjoy the new solo episodes that are going to start coming out. They will involve readings, will involve comparison of readings, and I'm going to try to apply the readings today and go through controversies and different interpretations and try to apply them to contemporary problems to see if any of them actually help us deal with where we are. Maybe there's some unabandoned frameworks that we need to pick back up. Maybe there's some new ones that we should drop. But I've had a good time doing this, and I hope you guys follow the show into its new direction. Look at the show notes, download this, and protect your peace. Thank you all.